The mining colony of New Mesa sat on the edge of explored space like a forgotten dream. Rust-colored dust covered everything and the air tasted like metal and regret. Humanity had claimed this planet 3 decades ago, but claiming and taming were two different things. The prefabricated structures huddled together against the harsh wind, and the people inside them huddled even closer. Here on the frontier, the laws of Earth meant nothing, and the alien overseers from the Krell Empire ruled with fists made of iron and hearts made of ice. Jake Morrison had drifted into the colony 6 months back with nothing but a worn duffel bag and eyes that had seen too much. He never talked about his past, and nobody asked because everyone here was running from something. The deep mine swallowed him up along with 100 other humans who needed work more than they needed safety. His hands grew calloused and his back grew strong, and he kept his head down and his mouth shut. That was how you survived on New Mesa. The medical center stood at the edge of the colony compound like an afterthought. It was understaffed and overwhelmed and held together with hope and duct tape. The doctors did what they could with equipment that should have been replaced years ago, and supplies that never seemed to arrive on time. Jake had been there once for a broken finger, and had left as quickly as possible because places like that reminded him of things he wanted to forget. But then he saw her and everything changed. Claire Henderson worked in the medical center administrative office because working was what kept her sane. 3 months ago, a cave-in had crushed her spine and stolen her legs and left her in a motorized wheelchair that hummed softly as it moved. She was 26 years old and should have been angry at the universe for what it had taken from her, but instead she smiled at everyone who passed and organized safety meetings and refused to let her circumstances define her worth. People loved her because she reminded them that humanity was more than just survival. Jake noticed her the way everyone noticed her, but he noticed something else too. He saw how she gripped the armrests of her chair when the pain got bad. He saw how her smile sometimes flickered when she thought nobody was looking. He saw a warrior in a broken body still fighting a war that most people would have surrendered to long ago. It stirred something in him that he thought had died years before. The Krell Overseer Commander Vex was 9 feet of scales and muscle and casual cruelty. His species had conquered a dozen worlds before humanity even reached the stars, and he never let anyone forget it. He viewed humans the way a farmer views livestock and treated them accordingly. His second-in-command, Drath, was worse because Drath enjoyed the suffering. He walked through the colony looking for reasons to punish someone, and he always found them. On a Tuesday morning, when the twin suns barely cut through the dust storms, Drath made his announcement. Medical supplies had gone missing from the center storage. Expensive nanite packages that could heal almost anything and could be sold for a fortune on the black market. Someone had stolen them, and Drath had found the evidence. The evidence was in Claire Henderson's quarters. Everyone knew it was a setup. Everyone knew Drath had planted the packages there himself. But knowing and proving were two different things, and proof required courage that could get you killed. The colony gathered in the central square because attendance was mandatory and watched as Drath dragged Claire before Commander Vex. Her wheelchair hummed softly in the silence, and her hands were steady even though her face was pale. Drath smiled with too many teeth and explained how he had found the stolen property. Commander Vex listened with yellow eyes that showed neither interest nor mercy. The trial lasted 10 minutes because Krell justice was efficient if nothing else. Claire denied the charges in a voice that did not shake, and Vex dismissed her denial with a wave of one clawed hand. The sentence was 300 lashes. The crowd drew in a collective breath because 300 lashes would kill a healthy, strong man. 300 lashes on someone in Claire's condition was just execution with extra steps. Some people looked away because they could not bear to watch injustice parade itself as law. Others clenched their fists and bit their tongues and hated themselves for their own powerlessness. A few women started to cry. That was when Jake stepped forward. He moved through the crowd like water flowing downhill with quiet inevitability. People parted for him without quite knowing why. He walked right up to the platform where Vex sat on his throne-like chair, and Drath stood with his whip already in hand. He looked up at the Krell commander and spoke in a voice that carried across the square. Said he would take her place. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the prefab buildings. Vex leaned forward with something like curiosity flickering in those reptilian eyes. He asked Jake to repeat himself as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. Jake said it again. He said the law allowed for substitution if someone volunteered. He said he was volunteering. He said to give him the 300 lashes instead of Claire Henderson. Beck studied him like a scientist studies an interesting specimen. He asked why Jake would do such a thing. He pointed out that Jake and Claire were not family and not mated and barely knew each other. He asked what possible reason a man could have for volunteering to die for a woman he had no obligation to. Jake said because it was the right thing to do. He said because she did not steal anything. He said because everyone here knew it. The last part was dangerous. It was a direct challenge to Vex's authority and could have earned Jake a summary execution right there in the square. But Vex did not order him killed. Instead, the Krell commander sat back in his chair and made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. He accepted the substitution. He said that at dawn tomorrow Jake Morrison would receive 300 lashes in place of Claire Henderson. He said that if Jake survived, then perhaps he would reconsider the evidence. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt that they would ever get. Jake nodded once and turned to walk away. Behind him, Claire was calling his name and trying to follow in her wheelchair, but the crowd had erupted into chaos. Some people cheered because Jake's courage had given them hope. Others mourned because they knew that no human had ever survived 300 lashes from a Krell whip. The smart money said Jake Morrison would be dead before noon tomorrow. But Jake just walked back to his quarters and closed the door and began to prepare himself for what was coming. Jake sat in his small quarters as the sun set and thought about pain. He had known plenty of it in his 34 years. He had been a soldier once in a war that nobody remembered anymore. He had lost people he loved and made choices he regretted and carried scars both visible and hidden. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be pain measured in seconds and minutes with death waiting at the end if he was not strong enough or lucky enough or stubborn enough to refuse it. He did not pray because he had stopped, believing in God somewhere between his first kill and his last loss. He did not make plans because planning required a future, and his future depended entirely on whether his body could endure what his mind had already committed to. Instead, he sat cross-legged on his bunk and breathed slowly and tried to find that quiet place inside himself where pain could not reach. The knock on his door came an hour after sunset. He knew who it was before he opened it. Claire sat in her wheelchair in the corridor with tears on her face and fury in her eyes. She did not wait for an invitation but drove her chair forward, forcing him to step back and let her enter. He closed the door behind her and waited for her to speak. She said he could not do this. She said 300 lashes would kill him. She said he had just volunteered for execution and she would not let him die for her. Jake sat down on his bunk so they were at eye level. He said maybe he would die and maybe he would not. He said he had survived worse odds, though that was probably a lie. He said he was going through with it regardless of what she wanted because the decision was made and could not be unmade. Claire wiped her eyes and asked why. She said he barely knew her. She asked what possible reason he could have for throwing his life away for a stranger. Jake looked at her for a long moment before answering. He said he knew enough. He knew she had spent 3 months after her accident making New Mesa more bearable for everyone around her. He knew she advocated for safety protocols and organized entertainment, and visited the sick even though she herself was struggling. He knew she brought light to a dark place and that people like that were rare and worth protecting. He said she did not steal those medical supplies, and letting her die for a crime she did not commit was not something he could live with. Claire started crying harder. She said that was not a good enough reason to die. Jake smiled slightly and said he was not planning on dying. He said he was planning on surviving. He said when he did survive, he and Claire were going to have a conversation about what happened next. She looked at him with confusion and something that might have been hope. She asked what he meant. He explained there was an old law from Earth's frontier days. He said when a man took a punishment meant for a woman and survived, she became his responsibility. He said under the old codes that meant marriage. He said if he survived tomorrow, he wanted her to marry him. Claire stared at him like he had lost his mind. She said that law did not apply here. She said it was ancient history and had no legal standing. Jake nodded and agreed. He said maybe it had no legal standing, but he figured if he was going through 300 lashes, he ought to get something out of it. He said he had been alone for a long time. He said watching her refuse to give up over the past 6 months had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. He said some people were worth fighting for. He said if he survived, she would become Claire Morrison, and that was the deal he was offering. She said he was insane. He said probably, but he was also serious. He reached out and took her hand and held it gently. He said his life had not meant much for a long time, but dying to save hers would give it meaning. He said living to build a life with her would give it even more. Claire could not speak. She squeezed his hand and cried and finally nodded. She said if he survived, she would marry him. She said she would marry him gladly. She said she had noticed him too over the past months. She said his quiet strength and his kindness to the other miners and the way he never looked at her wheelchair, but always looked at her. She said if he was crazy enough to take 300 lashes for her, then she was crazy enough to spend her life with him. They sat together for hours talking about everything and nothing. Jake told her about growing up on Mars in the domed cities. Claire told him about her childhood on Earth in a place called Colorado, where mountains touched the sky. They talked about dreams they had abandoned and hopes they still carried. They talked about the life they would build together if Jake survived, and Claire tried not to think about the word if. When it was nearly midnight, Jake said she should go. He said he needed to prepare mentally and she needed to rest. Claire did not want to leave, but she understood. She drove her chair to the door and then turned back. She said his name softly, and when he looked at her, she said she loved him. She said she knew it was too soon and too sudden, but watching him volunteer to die for her had cracked something open in her chest. She said whatever happened tomorrow, she wanted him to know that someone loved him. Jake crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her wheelchair. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently. He said he loved her too. He said he had probably loved her since the first time he saw her smile. He said tomorrow when he was on that post taking those lashes, he would think of her, and that would give him strength to endure. Claire kissed him back, and then she was gone. Jake closed the door and returned to his meditation. He thought about Claire and let that thought fill him with purpose. Pain was coming, but so was life. Death was possible, but so was love. He had made his choice and would not regret it. The night passed slowly. Jake did not sleep, but entered a state that was not quite waking and not quite dreaming. He rehearsed in his mind what was coming. The first lash and the shock of it. The 10th lash and the pain building. The 50th lash and his back torn open. The 100th lash and consciousness wavering. The 200th lash and every nerve screaming. The 300th lash and either survival or oblivion. He thought about how pain was just electricity in the nervous system. He thought about how the mind could reinterpret that electricity if trained properly. He thought about how every moment of pain would pass and be replaced by the next moment. He thought about counting each lash as a step toward Claire and their future together. When dawn came, Jake rose and washed his face and put on loose pants and nothing else. His back would need to be bare for the whip. He looked at himself in the small mirror and saw a man who was about to endure hell. He saw a man who had found something worth enduring hell for. He saw a man who was terrified but would not back down. He opened his door and stepped out into the orange light of the twin suns rising over New Mesa. The colony was already awake. Everyone would be there to watch because Vex had made attendance mandatory. They would see him survive or they would see him die, but either way they would see what a human could endure for love. Jake walked toward the central square. With each step he thought of Claire. With each breath he prepared himself for pain. With each heartbeat he committed himself to survival. The whipping post waited for him in the center of the square, like a promise or a threat or both. He walked toward it without hesitation because turning back was not an option and never had been. The crowd parted for him in silence. He saw Claire in the front row sitting in her wheelchair with her hands clasped together. Their eyes met and he saw fear and love and desperate hope in her gaze. He smiled at her to tell her it would be okay, even though he did not know if that was true. Then he turned to the post and gripped it with both hands and nodded to Drath. He said he was ready. His voice was steady. His hands did not shake. Inside his head he began counting down from 300. The first lash fell like lightning and thunder combined. The Krell whip was not made for mercy but for maximum pain, and it delivered exactly what it promised. Jake felt his skin split and his muscles scream and every nerve in his back catch fire. His body tensed against the post and his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, but he made no sound. He had promised himself he would not scream, and he would keep that promise for as long as he could. Drath took his time between lashes. He wanted Jake to feel each one individually. He wanted the pain to build rather than blur together. He wanted this human who had challenged Krell authority to understand the price of defiance. The enforcer smiled as he wound up for the second strike and brought the whip down with precision and force. 2. Jake counted silently. 298 to go. The third lash crossed the first two, making an X of torn flesh. Blood began to flow down Jake's back in thin rivers. The fourth lash caught his right shoulder and wrapped around his side. The fifth tore open his left shoulder blade. By the 10th lash, his back was a map of agony drawn in blood and torn skin. Claire watched from her wheelchair in the front row. She had wanted to look away, but forced herself to watch. If Jake could endure this, then she could endure watching it. Tears streamed down her face, and her hands gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. Other humans stood around her. Some looked away. Some watched in horror. Some whispered prayers to gods they were not sure existed. By the 20th lash, some people in the crowd were crying openly. By the 30th, several had turned away, unable to watch anymore. By the 40th, the colony doctor had moved closer with medical supplies ready to intervene if Jake's heart stopped. Everyone knew that if it stopped, there would be no restarting it. 50 lashes. Jake's back was no longer recognizable as human skin. It was meat and blood and exposed muscle. His grip on the post had not loosened. His legs still held him upright. His breathing came in controlled gasps timed to the rhythm of the whip. In his mind, he counted each strike as a step toward Claire. 50 steps taken, 250 to go. Commander Vex watched from his elevated platform with increasing interest. He had seen many humans punished over his years of command. Most broke before 50 lashes. Most begged for mercy or death. This one, called Jake Morrison, had not made a sound. Had not pleaded. Had not even slumped against the post. Vex leaned forward slightly, wanting to see how long this human could last. 75 lashes. The pool of blood at Jake's feet was spreading. His body trembled but did not fall. In his mind, he was somewhere else. He was walking through mountains in Colorado with Claire beside him. He was watching her smile. He was hearing her laugh. He was building a life with her, one moment at a time. The pain was enormous, but it was just sensation. It was just information. It did not have to control him. 100 lashes. The crowd was silent except for quiet sobbing. The doctor had tears running down his face. Even some of the Krell guards looked uncomfortable. Drath himself had stopped smiling. His arm was getting tired, and he had 200 lashes still to deliver. He paused to rest and looked at Jake with something that might have been respect or might have been frustration. Jake used the pause to breathe deeply. He could feel consciousness wavering at the edges. His body was going into shock. Blood loss was becoming critical. He knew the next 100 lashes would be harder than the first 100. He knew the 100 after that would be nearly impossible. But impossible was just a word. Claire had lived 3 months in a wheelchair in a mining colony and never stopped fighting. He could endure this for her. 125 lashes. Jake's vision started to gray. He blinked hard and forced himself to focus. He looked at Claire in the front row. Her eyes met his, and in that moment he saw everything he needed. He saw love and faith and the promise of tomorrow. He drew strength from her gaze and held on. 150 lashes. Halfway there, Jake's body was failing. He could feel it in the way his legs shook, in the way his hands were starting to slip on the post, in the way his lungs could not quite get enough air. But his mind was still clear. His will was still iron. He had survived worse than this, even if he could not remember when. 175 lashes. The doctor stepped forward and said something to Vex, probably asking if this could stop. Probably pointing out that Jake would die if it continued. Vex waved him away irritably. The human had volunteered. The human would receive exactly what he had been sentenced to. There would be no mercy because mercy was not part of Krell law. 200 lashes. Jake's legs buckled. For a moment he hung from the post by his hands alone. The crowd gasped, thinking he was finally falling. But then Jake pulled himself upright again. His legs straightened. His grip tightened. He stood there bleeding and broken but not defeated. He looked over his shoulder at Drath and nodded for him to continue. Drath stared at him with something like awe. No human should still be conscious. No human should still be standing. This Jake Morrison was either the toughest specimen Drath had ever encountered, or too stupid to know when to quit. Either way, the enforcer had a job to finish. He raised his whip and brought it down again. 225 lashes. Jake could no longer feel his back. The nerves had been damaged beyond the point of sending signals. Paradoxically, this made things easier. The pain was still enormous, but it was distant now. Abstract. He floated in a gray space where only willpower mattered. He thought of Claire. He counted the lashes. He refused to fall. 250 lashes. The crowd had stopped crying because they were beyond tears. They watched in stunned silence as this man endured what no man should be able to endure. Some of them would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Some of them would tell their children about the cowboy who took 300 lashes for love. Some of them would find their own courage in the memory of Jake Morrison standing at that post. 275 lashes. Jake's consciousness was a flickering candle in a storm. He could barely see, could barely think, but he could still count. 25 more. Just 25. He had come too far to fail now. He had promised Claire he would survive. He had promised her a life together. He would not break that promise. 290 lashes. 10 to go. Jake's body was beyond broken. It was a miracle of stubborn will holding together flesh that should have collapsed hours ago. His breathing was shallow. His heartbeat irregular. The doctor was shouting something, but Jake could not hear words anymore. Only numbers. 291. 292. 293, 299. One more, just one more. Jake summoned everything he had left. Every ounce of strength, every fragment of will, every atom of determination. He thought of Claire waiting for him. He thought of their life together. He thought of all the tomorrows they would share. He held onto the post and stood straight despite everything. 300. The whip fell for the final time. Jake felt it, but distantly, like something happening to someone else. Drath lowered the whip and stepped back. The square fell silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Everyone waited to see if Jake would fall. Jake stood there for a long moment. His hands were still locked around the post. His legs still held him upright. Blood covered him from neck to waist, but his heart still beat. His lungs still drew air. He had survived. He turned his head and looked at Claire. He smiled at her. He tried to say something, but his voice would not work. He tried to take a step toward her, but his legs finally gave out. He fell forward and the world went black before he hit the ground. The doctor and his assistants rushed forward. The crowd erupted in noise. Some people cheered. Some people screamed. Claire was trying to get to Jake, but people were in the way. Commander Vex stood slowly from his throne with an expression that might have been amazement. Jake Morrison had survived 300 lashes. He had done the impossible, and now his fate rested in the hands of doctors who would work through the night to keep him alive. The medical center became a place of vigil. Jake lay face down on a specialized bed with machines monitoring his vital signs and tubes feeding him nutrients and pain medication. His back was a ruin of torn flesh that the doctors had spent 8 hours cleaning and treating. They used every medical supply they had, including the stolen nanite packages that had mysteriously reappeared in the medical storage. No one asked questions about how they got back. Some things were better left unexamined. Claire refused to leave his side. She had herself transferred to the medical center and positioned her wheelchair next to Jake's bed. The doctors tried to convince her to rest, but she would not listen. She sat there hour after hour holding his hand and talking to him even though he could not hear her. She told him about her childhood in Colorado, about her parents who had died when she was young, about her dreams of exploring the galaxy before the accident took her legs, about the life they would build together when he woke up because he would wake up because he had to. The first day passed with no change. Jake's body was in shock and his mind had retreated somewhere deep where pain could not reach. His heart beat steadily but slowly. His breathing was shallow but regular. The doctors said the next 72 hours were critical. If he survived 3 days, he would probably survive. If he did not wake up by then, he probably never would. Claire talked to him constantly. She described the sunset through the medical center window. She told him about the workers who came by to ask about him. She read to him from a book of poetry someone had donated to the medical center library. She sang to him in a soft voice songs her mother had taught her. She refused to believe he would not come back to her. The second day brought a fever. Jake's body was fighting infection despite the antibiotics. His temperature climbed dangerously high. The doctors packed him in cooling blankets and increased his medications. Claire held his hand and felt it burning in hers. She begged him not to die. She told him she needed him. She said she could not lose him now after everything. The colony waited. Word had spread throughout New Mesa about Jake's survival of the lashes. Workers came by the medical center to leave small gifts, flowers made from scraps of colored fabric, food they could barely spare, notes of encouragement and gratitude. Claire read each note to Jake's unconscious form. She told him how many people he had inspired, how his sacrifice had reminded everyone what humanity meant. The third day was the worst. Jake's fever broke, but he still did not wake. The doctors began to worry about brain damage from blood loss. They did more scans and checked his responses and shook their heads with concern. Claire sat beside him and cried. She had been so strong for 3 days, but now her strength was failing. She laid her head on the edge of his bed and whispered, "Please," over and over like a prayer. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake's eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, not understanding where he was or what had happened. Then he tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Claire was asleep in her wheelchair with her head resting on the bed. She did not notice at first that he was awake. Jake moved his hand slightly and touched her hair. Claire jerked awake and looked at him. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Claire started crying and laughing at the same time. She called for the doctor while holding Jake's hand. She said his name over and over. She said he was awake and alive and had come back to her. The doctor rushed in and began checking Jake's vital signs and responses. Everything looked good considering what he had endured. Jake tried to speak again and the doctor brought water to his lips. Jake drank slowly and then managed to say one word. "Claire." Claire was crying too hard to answer, but she squeezed his hand. Jake smiled weakly and said, "Did I survive?" Claire laughed and cried and said, "Yes, you idiot, you survived." Jake's smile widened slightly. He said, "Then I believe you owe me a wedding." The doctor insisted Jake rest, but Jake wanted to stay awake. He wanted to hear Claire's voice. He wanted to see her face. He wanted to make sure this was real and not some dying dream. Claire stayed beside him for hours, telling him everything that had happened. She told him about Commander Vex dropping the charges against her. She told him about the colony rallying around them. She told him about the gifts and notes from grateful workers. Jake listened and absorbed it all. He said he did not remember much after Lash 200. The pain had taken him somewhere else, and he had just counted and breathed and thought of her. He said knowing she was waiting for him was the only thing that kept him standing. He said loving her had made him stronger than he knew he could be. Over the following days, Jake's recovery progressed faster than the doctors expected. His back was healing with the help of the nanites, though it would be scarred forever. By the end of the first week, he could sit up. By the end of the second, he could stand with help. His body seemed determined to survive now that it had already survived the impossible. Claire was with him every step of the way. She helped him with physical therapy. She read to him when he needed distraction from the pain. She made him laugh with stories from her work in the administrative office. They planned their wedding in quiet conversations when the medical center was dark and only the machines hummed around them. Commander Vex summoned Jake once he was well enough to walk. Claire wanted to come, but Jake said he needed to do this alone. He made his way slowly to the Krell commander's office. Each step pulled at the healing wounds on his back, but he walked straight and steady. He would not show weakness to Vex. The Krell commander studied him with those yellow reptilian eyes. Vex said Jake was either the toughest human he had encountered, or the most foolish, or perhaps both. He said the charges against Claire Henderson had been officially dropped. He said Drath had been reminded about the proper handling of evidence. It was the closest to an apology they would ever receive. Then Vex surprised Jake by offering him a promotion. He said he had been observing humans for many years and most broke easily under pressure. But Jake had endured. This quality interested Vex. He wanted Jake as shift supervisor over the mining operations. The pay would be better and the quarters would be better, and Jake would have some authority over working conditions. Jake thought about refusing. Part of him wanted to spit in Vex's face and tell him what he could do with his promotion. But he thought of Claire and their future. He thought about the extra credits they would need. He thought about being in a position to actually improve conditions for the other workers. So he said yes, but with conditions. He wanted Claire as his assistant supervisor. He wanted funding for better safety equipment. He wanted regular inspections of the mine structures. Vex's expression might have been amusement. He said Jake had courage to bargain even now, but he agreed to the conditions. He told Jake not to make him regret this decision. Jake said he would not. They understood each other now. Vex respected strength and Jake had proven he had it. Their relationship would never be friendly, but it would be based on mutual respect. Jake returned to the medical center and told Claire everything. She was amazed by his promotion and thrilled by her own new position. They talked about what they could accomplish with their new authority. Better safety protocols, proper equipment maintenance, fair treatment for all workers. They could make a real difference on New Mesa, but first they had a wedding to plan. The colony came together to help. Workers donated credits from their meager savings. Someone found white fabric and the women sewed Claire a simple but beautiful dress. The chaplain agreed to perform the ceremony in the colony common area. Someone else found lights to string across the ceiling. Even some of the Krell guards contributed supplies for a celebration feast. Jake stood one evening looking at his scarred back in a mirror. The wounds had healed into thick white lines that would never fully fade. They covered him from shoulders to waist in a brutal pattern that told the story of what he had endured. Claire came up behind him in her wheelchair. She said the scars were beautiful because they represented his love for her. She said she would spend the rest of her life being worthy of them. The wedding took place on a Sunday evening when the work week ended, and the colony could breathe for a few hours. The common area had been transformed by loving hands and generous hearts. Strings of lights crisscrossed the ceiling, casting a warm glow over everything. Tables made from stacked storage crates held food that people had saved and hoarded and now gladly shared. Flowers made from colored paper and fabric decorated every surface. It was not fancy, but it was beautiful because it was made with love. Claire sat in her wheelchair in the small side room getting ready. 3 women from the colony helped her with her dress and her hair. The dress was simple white fabric stitched together by hand, but it fit her perfectly. Someone had found makeup somewhere, and Claire's face glowed with carefully applied color. Her dark hair was arranged in soft curls that framed her face. She looked radiant despite the wheelchair beneath her. One of the women helping her said Claire was the most beautiful bride New Mesa had ever seen. Claire laughed and said she was probably the only bride New Mesa had seen in 5 years. But she felt beautiful. She felt cherished. She felt like the luckiest woman in the galaxy because in a few minutes she would marry Jake Morrison. Jake waited in the common area wearing the best clothes he owned. Someone had found him a jacket that almost fit, and pants that were only slightly too short. His hair was combed back and his face was freshly shaved. The scars on his back pulled tight under the fabric of his shirt, but he stood straight and tall. His hands were not quite steady because he was nervous in a way that 300 lashes had not made him nervous. The colony chaplain stood beside Jake. His name was Henry, and he was 70 years old with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He had been a minister back on Earth before age, and wandering feet brought him to the frontier. He performed services every Sunday in a converted storage room and counseled workers through their hardships. He had agreed immediately to marry Jake and Claire because their love story had touched his heart. The common area filled with people. Every human worker in New Mesa came if they could. Some brought children who stared wide-eyed at the decorations. Others brought elderly or sick friends so they could witness something joyful. Even a few of the more sympathetic Krell guards stood at the back watching with curiosity. Commander Vex had not come, but he had sent a gift. A bottle of real earth wine that must have cost him significant credits. Music started playing from old speakers someone had rigged up. It was scratchy and kept skipping, but no one cared. The crowd turned toward the side room door. Claire appeared in the doorway in her wheelchair with her white dress spreading around her like a cloud. 2 friends walked beside her as she guided her chair forward through the crowd. People smiled and some cried, and everyone felt the weight of the moment. Jake watched Claire come toward him and thought his heart might burst. She was so beautiful it hurt to look at her. But more than beautiful, she was strong and brave and kind. She had survived her accident. She had endured false accusations. She had watched him nearly die for her, and now she was here choosing to spend her life with him. He did not deserve her, but he would spend every day trying to be worthy of her choice. Claire reached the front and positioned her wheelchair beside Jake. He reached down and took her hand. Their eyes met and the rest of the world fell away. There was only the 2 of them and the promises they were about to make. Henry began the ceremony. He spoke about love and sacrifice and the bonds that form between people who have survived hardship together. He said everyone present had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen Jake volunteer to die for Claire. They had seen him endure 300 lashes. They had seen him survive the impossible. He said that kind of love was rare and precious and should be celebrated and protected. Then he asked Jake and Claire to speak their vows. They had written them together during Jake's recovery, simple words that came from the heart. Jake spoke first. His voice was rough with emotion but steady. He said he had been drifting before he came to New Mesa. He said he had been running from his past and not sure he had a future worth living for. He said Claire had changed everything. He said watching her refuse to let her circumstances break her spirit had reminded him that life was worth fighting for. He said some things mattered more than survival. He said some people were worth any sacrifice. He said he took those lashes gladly because a world without her in it was not a world he wanted to live in. He promised to love her and protect her and stand beside her for all the days he had left. Claire tried to speak, but emotion choked her voice. She wiped her eyes and took a breath and tried again. She said she never expected to find happiness on New Mesa. She said the accident had taken so much from her legs and her mobility and her sense of safety. But then Jake had given her something back. He had shown her what it meant to be truly loved. He had shown her that she was worth fighting for even when she felt broken and useless. He had endured unimaginable pain so that she might live. She said she would spend the rest of her life proving his sacrifice was not wasted. She promised to love him and support him and be his partner in everything. She said even though she could not physically stand beside him, she would always stand with him in every way that mattered. There was not a dry eye in the room. Even the toughest miners were wiping their faces. Even the Krell guards looked moved, though they would never admit it. Henry asked for the rings. Jake had traded his entire month's wages for 2 simple bands of metal. Nothing fancy, but they were solid and real. He slipped one on Claire's finger and she slipped one on his. Their hands clasped together as Henry pronounced them married. Jake leaned down and kissed Claire gently. The room erupted in cheers and applause. People whistled and stomped their feet. Someone started the music again and others pushed the tables back to create a dance floor. The celebration began. Food appeared on plates. The mysterious earth wine was opened and poured into whatever cups people could find. Someone made a toast to the bride and groom. Someone else made a toast to love and survival. The children ran around laughing. The adults relaxed and smiled and forgot for a few hours about the hardships of mining colony life. Jake wheeled Claire around the room so she could greet everyone. People congratulated them and shared their own stories. An old miner told Jake his courage had inspired him to write a letter to his estranged daughter back on Earth. A young woman told Claire that seeing her thrive despite her disability had helped her accept her own scarred face from a mining accident. A father thanked them both because their wedding had given his children something beautiful to remember. Later in the evening, someone put on slow music. Couples moved onto the makeshift dance floor. Jake knelt beside Claire's wheelchair and said he wished he could dance with her. Claire said they would dance someday. She said she believed it with all her heart. For now, this was enough. Being together. Being married. Being surrounded by people who cared about them. The party continued late into the night. Eventually, people started heading back to their quarters. They hugged Jake and Claire and thanked them for sharing their joy. The common area slowly emptied until only a few friends remained helping clean up. Jake wheeled Claire toward their new quarters. The married housing was better than what they had before. 2 rooms instead of 1. A small kitchen area. A window that looked out over the rust-colored landscape. It was not much, but it was theirs. They entered their new home as husband and wife. Jake helped Claire transfer from her wheelchair to their bed. He was gentle with her and she was gentle with him because his back still hurt when he moved wrong. They lay together in the darkness, holding each other. Claire said she was happier than she had ever been in her life. Jake said he felt the same way. She said she could not believe this was real. That morning 4 weeks ago, she had been sentenced to death, and now she was married to the most amazing man she had ever met. Jake kissed her forehead and said he was the lucky one. He said marrying her was the best decision he had ever made. She laughed and pointed out that technically he had blackmailed her into it. He had said he would only take the lashes if she agreed to marry him if he survived. Jake grinned and said it was the best blackmail either of them had ever agreed to. They fell asleep in each other's arms. Outside, the twin moons rose over New Mesa. Inside, two people who had survived the impossible began the first night of their life together. The months after the wedding brought changes to New Mesa that no one had expected. Jake took his new position as shift supervisor seriously and used his authority to push for reforms. He personally inspected every section of the mines. He identified dangerous areas and shut them down until proper reinforcement could be installed. He reorganized work schedules so that no one worked longer than 10 hours without rest. He established safety protocols and made sure everyone followed them, including the Krell overseers. Some of the other supervisors resented Jake for making waves. They said he was being too cautious and too demanding. But the workers loved him because for the first time, someone in authority actually cared whether they lived or died. Accident rates dropped by 40% in the first 3 months. Productivity actually increased because workers who felt safe worked harder and smarter. Claire thrived in her role as assistant supervisor. She redesigned the administrative systems to be more efficient. She created a database tracking equipment maintenance and worker certifications. She established a grievance process so workers could report problems without fear of retaliation. Her wheelchair became a common sight throughout the colony as she moved from office to mine entrance to storage depot, making sure everything ran smoothly. More importantly, Claire worked to make New Mesa more accessible for everyone with disabilities. She identified barriers that prevented people from working and found solutions. She convinced Vex to fund ramps and wider doorways. She created modified workstations for people with various limitations. Under her guidance, 3 workers who had been deemed unable to work due to injuries returned to productive jobs. Jake and Claire became symbols of hope for the colony. Their story had spread beyond New Mesa through news feeds and personal communications. Reporters wanted interviews. Documentary makers wanted to film them. Marriage proposals increased across human space as people were inspired by the Cowboy, who took 300 lashes for love. But Jake and Claire avoided the spotlight as much as possible. They were just 2 people trying to build a good life together. They worked hard during the day and came home to each other at night. They talked about their dreams over simple dinners in their small quarters. They supported each other through the hard days when Jake's back ached or Claire's legs hurt with phantom pain. 6 months into their marriage, a medical supply ship arrived at New Mesa on its regular rotation. The captain brought a message for Claire from a doctor named Helen Price who worked at a research hospital on Mars. Dr. Price had heard about Claire's case and wanted to offer help. She specialized in spinal injuries and had access to experimental technology that might be able to repair the damage to Claire's spine. Claire read the message 3 times before showing it to Jake. Her hand shook as she handed him the tablet. Jake read it carefully and then looked at his wife. He asked what she wanted to do. Claire said she did not know. She said she had learned to live with her disability. She had built a life she was proud of. She had proven that being in a wheelchair did not define her worth or limit her contributions. What if hoping for more was just setting herself up for disappointment? What if the treatment failed and she was worse off than before? What if she should just be grateful for what she had? Jake took her hands in his. He said these were all fair concerns. He said he would support whatever decision she made without reservation. But he reminded her of something she had taught him. He said she had shown him that some things were worth fighting for even when the outcome was uncertain. He said she had refused to give up after her accident even when giving up would have been easier. He said the possibility of walking again was worth exploring at least. Claire thought about it for several days. She talked to the colony doctor who said the experimental treatment was promising, but carried risks. She talked to other workers who had disabilities and asked their opinions. She prayed and meditated and tried to imagine her future both ways. Finally, she made her decision. She would go to Mars and meet with Dr. Price. She would learn about the experimental treatment and make an informed choice. Jake would go with her because they were partners in everything now. Arranging leave from their positions took 2 weeks. Commander Vex was surprisingly accommodating. He granted them both a month of leave and even arranged transportation on a supply ship, heading toward the inner planets. Jake suspected Vex was curious about whether the treatment would work. The Krell commander had developed an odd sort of respect for both Jake and Claire. The journey to Mars took 3 weeks. The supply ship was cramped and uncomfortable, but Jake and Claire did not mind. They spent the time talking about possibilities. What it would mean if the treatment worked. What they would do if it did not. how they would handle either outcome together. They also talked about the future beyond the immediate question of Claire's legs. Jake admitted he had been thinking about eventually leaving New Mesa. Not right away, but someday. He said they had made real improvements to the colony, but there was a limit to what they could accomplish under Krell rule. He said he dreamed of working somewhere that humans were not second-class citizens. Claire said she had been thinking the same thing. She said New Mesa would always be special to them because it was where they met and fell in love. But it was also a hard place full of painful memories. She said when the time was right, she would like to see Earth. She wanted to visit Colorado where she grew up. She wanted to show Jake the mountains she remembered from childhood. They arrived at Mars Research Hospital on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Helen Price met them in her office. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced precision. She explained the treatment to Claire in detail. It involved advanced nanites and neural bridges that would attempt to repair the damaged spinal cord. The success rate was 60%. The risks included infection, rejection of the nanites, further nerve damage, and in rare cases, death. Dr. Price said Claire was an excellent candidate because her injury was relatively recent and localized. The surrounding tissue was healthy. Her overall physical condition was good. If the treatment was going to work for anyone, it would work for Claire. Claire asked how long recovery would take if the treatment was successful. Dr. Price said at least 3 months of intensive physical therapy. Maybe longer. The neural pathways would need time to rebuild. The muscles in Claire's legs had atrophied and would need to be strengthened. It would be hard work with no guarantees. Claire looked at Jake. He squeezed her hand and said the choice was hers. He would be there either way. She turned back to Dr. Price and said she wanted to do it. She said she wanted the chance to walk again even if the odds were not perfect. She said she had spent 6 months proving she could live a full life without her legs. Now she wanted to spend the next 6 months fighting to get them back. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Jake and Claire spent that time exploring Mars as much as they could. They visited the domed cities where Jake had grown up. They ate at restaurants that served real Earth food. They watched the sunset turn the red planet's sky purple and gold. They held hands and tried not to think too hard about the surgery. The night before the procedure, Claire could not sleep. She lay in their temporary quarters staring at the ceiling. Jake was awake too. He asked what she was thinking about. Claire said she was scared. She said she knew the surgery was the right choice, but that did not make it less frightening. She said, what if it did not work? What if she went through all that pain and therapy and ended up right back in the wheelchair? What if she got her hopes up only to have them crushed? Jake rolled onto his side so he could look at her. He said fear was normal and healthy. He said only fools were never afraid. He said courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. He said she had already proven she had that kind of courage. She had survived an accident that should have killed her. She had endured false accusations. She had watched him take 300 lashes. She had built a new life from the ruins of her old one. This was just one more challenge, and she would face it the way she faced everything else, with strength and grace and determination. Claire cried and held him. She said she loved him more than she could express. She said knowing he would be there when she woke up made everything less scary. He said he would always be there. Through the surgery and the recovery and whatever came after, that was what forever meant. The surgery took 8 hours. Jake spent the entire time in the waiting area pacing like a caged animal. He could not sit still, could not read, could not think about anything except Claire on that operating table. He thought about how she had changed his life, how she had given him purpose and meaning, how losing her would break something in him that could never be repaired. He prayed to a God he still was not sure existed that the surgery would be successful. Other people came and went from the waiting area. Families waiting for news about their loved ones, doctors moving between surgeries, nurses checking on anxious relatives. They all gave Jake space because the look on his face told them he needed to be alone with his thoughts. Dr. Price finally emerged at hour 8. Her face was tired but not unhappy. She found Jake and pulled him aside. She said the procedure had gone as well as they could have hoped. The nanites were in place. The neural bridges were connecting properly. The damaged sections of Claire's spinal cord had been bypassed. But she cautioned Jake that they would not know if it worked for several weeks. The body needed time to heal. The connections needed to strengthen. Claire would need physical therapy and patience and a lot of hard work. Jake asked if he could see her. Dr. Price said yes, but warned him Claire would be groggy from anesthesia. She led him to the recovery room where Claire lay in a bed surrounded by monitors. She looked so small and pale. Jake pulled a chair beside her bed and took her hand. He sat there watching her breathe and sending silent prayers of thanks that she had survived. Claire woke an hour later. Her eyes fluttered open and found Jake immediately. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Jake helped her drink water through a straw. She asked in a hoarse whisper if the surgery was over. He said yes, and it had gone well. She asked if she could walk yet. He said not yet, but maybe soon. She smiled weakly and squeezed his hand before falling back asleep. The first 2 weeks were hard. Claire was in pain as her body healed from the invasive surgery. The incision along her spine ached constantly. She could not move much and had to lie flat on her back most of the time. Jake stayed with her constantly. He helped her eat. He read to her. He distracted her when the pain got bad. He was her anchor in a sea of discomfort and uncertainty. Dr. Price checked on Claire every day. She ran tests and scans. She examined the surgical site. She asked questions about pain levels and sensation, but she would not commit to a prognosis. She said they had to wait and see. Some patients responded to the treatment quickly. Others took months. Some never responded at all. On day 14, Dr. Price asked Claire if she felt anything in her legs. Claire concentrated and said she thought maybe she felt tingling in her toes, but she could not be sure. It might have been wishful thinking. It might have been phantom sensation. Dr. Price made notes and said time would tell. Jake watched Claire struggle with hope and fear. She wanted so badly to believe the treatment was working, but was terrified of being disappointed. Some days she was optimistic and talked about the things they would do when she could walk. Other days she was depressed and convinced the surgery had failed. Jake supported her through all of it. He reminded her that healing took time. He said they would face whatever came together. On day 21, Claire was certain she felt something. Not just tingling, but actual sensation. She could feel when Dr. Price touched her feet. She could feel pressure on her ankles. It was faint, but it was real. Dr. Price tried not to show too much excitement, but Jake could see hope in her eyes. The doctor said this was a very good sign. The neural pathways were connecting. Now they would start physical therapy. The physical therapy was brutal. Claire's leg muscles had atrophied during 6 months of paralysis. They needed to be rebuilt from almost nothing. The therapist started with simple exercises, flexing the toes, pointing the feet, bending the knees while lying down. Movements that healthy people took for granted required enormous effort from Claire. Jake attended every therapy session. He encouraged Claire when she wanted to quit. He celebrated every tiny victory. The first time she wiggled her toes on command, he nearly cried. The first time she flexed her ankle, he cheered loud enough that other patients stared. He was her biggest supporter and her fiercest advocate. Week by week, Claire grew stronger. She could bend her knees. She could lift her legs off the bed. She could sit up with support. The therapist was impressed with her progress and said she had rarely seen someone work so hard. Claire said she had something to work for. She had a husband who believed in her and a life she wanted to live standing up. 2 months after surgery, Claire attempted to stand for the first time. The therapist and Jake supported her on either side. They lifted her from the wheelchair and positioned her feet on the floor. Claire gripped their arms and tried to push herself upright. Her legs shook with effort. Sweat beaded on her forehead. For a moment it seemed like she might not be able to do it. Then Claire stood. Her legs held her weight. She was vertical and supported by her own muscles for the first time in 8 months. She lasted 10 seconds before her legs gave out, and Jake and the therapist lowered her back into the wheelchair. But those 10 seconds were everything. Claire was crying and laughing. Jake was crying too. The therapist was grinning and saying she knew Claire could do it. Progress accelerated after that. Claire stood for longer periods. She learned to shift her weight from foot to foot. She practiced taking steps while holding parallel bars. Her legs grew stronger daily. The muscles rebuilt themselves with the help of the nanites and Claire's relentless determination. 3 months after surgery, Claire walked across a room unassisted. She was shaky and slow and her balance was uncertain. But she walked from the parallel bars to where Jake stood 10 feet away. She walked into his arms and he caught her and held her and both of them cried. Dr. Price watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes too. Medical miracles were rare, but this was one of them. Claire continued therapy for another month. She learned to walk smoothly, to climb stairs, to stand for extended periods without tiring. Her gait would never be perfect, and she would always be more prone to fatigue than someone who had never been injured. But she could walk. She could run if she needed to. She could dance. On the day Dr. Price officially discharged Claire from her care, Jake took his wife to a dance hall in one of the Mars domes. It was nothing fancy, just a place where people gathered on Friday nights to drink and socialize and move to music. But to Jake and Claire it was paradise. Jake led Claire onto the dance floor. He put one arm around her waist and took her hand with the other. A slow song played from the speakers. They moved together, finding the rhythm. Claire's steps were careful but confident. She leaned against Jake and let him guide her. They danced for 3 songs, and Claire's legs held strong the entire time. When they finally sat down, Claire was exhausted but glowing. She said this was one of the best moments of her life, dancing with her husband on legs that worked, proving that the impossible was possible, showing that love and determination could overcome anything. Jake kissed her and said he was proud of her. He said she had worked so hard and earned this victory. He said watching her stand and walk and dance was worth every moment of those 300 lashes. She said his sacrifice had made this possible. She said if he had not endured that punishment, she would have died. She said everything good in her life now existed because of his choice that day. They sat together holding hands and watching other couples dance. They talked about returning to New Mesa. Claire said she wanted to go back and show everyone what had happened. She wanted to walk into the colony under her own power and prove that hope was real. Jake agreed but said they did not have to rush. They could take some time on Mars, maybe visit Earth, see the mountains in Colorado that Claire remembered. Claire said she would like that. She said she had spent so long focusing on what she could not do that she had forgotten to think about what she wanted to do. Now she could do almost anything. The future was wide open in a way it had not been since the accident. They made plans over the following days. They would spend 2 weeks on Earth. They would visit Colorado, and Claire would show Jake where she grew up. Then they would return to New Mesa and resume their work. They had made commitments there and would honor them. But eventually they would leave and find somewhere else to build their life. Somewhere that humans were free and valued. Somewhere they could raise children if they decided to have them. For now, though, they just enjoyed being together. They walked through the Mars domes holding hands. They ate at restaurants and watched shows and acted like tourists. They made love in their temporary quarters with Claire's legs wrapped around Jake's waist. They celebrated the victory of her recovery and the promise of their future together. The journey to Earth took 2 weeks on a commercial passenger ship. Jake and Claire spent most of the trip standing at the observation windows watching the stars drift past. Claire marveled at being able to stand for hours without her wheelchair. Jake marveled at her joy. They talked about their plans and their dreams, and the life they would build together once they finished their commitment to New Mesa. Earth appeared in the viewport like a blue and green jewel against the darkness of space. Claire pressed her face to the glass and cried at seeing her home planet after so many years away. Jake put his arm around her and said they were going home. Not forever, but for long enough to heal some old wounds and create new memories. They landed at Denver Spaceport in the Rocky Mountain region. Claire had not been back to Colorado since leaving for the frontier 8 years ago. Everything felt familiar and strange at the same time. The air smelled different. The gravity felt heavier than Mars or New Mesa. The crowds and noise and bustle of a major Earth city overwhelmed her senses after years in a small mining colony. They rented a ground vehicle and drove into the mountains. Claire directed Jake along roads she remembered from childhood. They passed through small towns and evergreen forests. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians. Snow-capped peaks touched the sky. Claire rolled down the window and breathed in the pine-scented air and felt 15 years old again. She directed Jake to a small town called Pine Ridge where she had grown up. It had not changed much. The same main street with the same shops. The same church with the white steeple. The same school where she had learned to read and write. They parked the vehicle and walked down the street together. Claire's steps were careful on the uneven sidewalk, but she walked without assistance, and that was everything. They visited the cemetery where Claire's parents were buried. She had been 18 when they died in a vehicle accident. The grief had driven her off-world seeking escape and adventure. She had found both but had never fully dealt with the loss. Now she stood at their graves with Jake beside her and finally said goodbye. She told them about Jake and the life they were building. She said she was happy now. She said she hoped they were proud of her. Jake held her while she cried and did not try to rush her grief. When she was ready, they walked back to town and found a small hotel. They spent 3 days in Pine Ridge. They hiked in the mountains, though Claire had to go slowly and rest often. They visited her childhood home, which now belonged to another family. They ate at the diner where teenage Claire had worked summers. They made love in their hotel room with the mountain air drifting through the open window. On the 4th day, they drove to a trailhead Claire remembered. It was a moderate hike to a viewpoint overlooking a valley. Claire said she used to come here when she needed to think. Jake asked if she was sure her legs were ready for a hike. She said there was only one way to find out. The hike took 2 hours with frequent rest stops. Claire's legs ached and her breathing was labored, but she refused to quit. Jake stayed close in case she stumbled, but she never did. When they reached the viewpoint, Claire stood looking out over the valley and started crying again. Jake asked if she was okay. She said she never thought she would stand here again. She said after the accident she had accepted that some places were lost to her forever. Being here now felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. They sat on a rock outcropping eating sandwiches they had packed. Jake said he understood why Claire loved this place. The mountains were beautiful and peaceful in a way that nothing on New Mesa could match. Claire said she was glad she got to share it with him. She said bringing him here felt like bridging the gap between her past and her future. As they sat there, Claire said she had been thinking about their long-term plans. She said she loved their work on New Mesa and the difference they were making. But she did not want to spend her whole life there. She said she wanted children someday and did not want to raise them under Krell rule. She wanted them to grow up free on Earth or Mars or one of the colony worlds where humans governed themselves. Jake said he had been thinking the same thing. He said they should finish their current contract on New Mesa, which had another year to run. They should train replacements and make sure the reforms they had implemented would continue. Then they should leave and find somewhere better. He said he had saved most of his earnings and Claire had saved hers. Between them, they had enough credits to make a new start wherever they wanted. Claire asked where Jake wanted to go. He said honestly he did not care as long as they were together. He said Earth would be fine or Mars or one of the outer colonies. He said the location mattered less than building a life with purpose and meaning. Claire said that sounded perfect to her. They spent 2 more weeks on Earth visiting other places Claire wanted to see. They went to the ocean and Claire walked barefoot in the sand. They visited New York and saw the rebuilt city that had been destroyed during the resource wars. They went to museums and parks and restaurants. They acted like newlyweds on a delayed honeymoon, because that was exactly what they were. When it was time to return to New Mesa, they did so reluctantly. Earth had been a beautiful interlude, but they had commitments to honor. The mining colony needed them and the workers depended on them. They boarded a transport ship and began the long journey back to the frontier. News of Claire's recovery had reached New Mesa before they did. When their shuttle landed, the entire colony turned out to greet them. Workers lined the landing pad cheering and clapping. Someone had made a banner that said, "Welcome home." Children held flowers made from colored fabric. Claire stepped off the shuttle on her own 2 feet and the crowd erupted. People were crying and cheering. They pressed forward to congratulate her and touch her as if her recovery was a miracle they needed to witness. Jake stayed close to Claire as she was mobbed with well-wishers. She hugged people and thanked them and showed off her ability to walk. Even Commander Vex came to greet them. The Krell commander looked at Claire standing upright and his expression was as close to impressed as a Krell could look. He said her recovery was remarkable. He said humans continued to surprise him with their resilience. He said he was pleased to have both Jake and Claire back because the colony had missed their leadership. Jake and Claire returned to their work with renewed energy. Claire walked the colony now instead of using her wheelchair. Workers saw her and remembered that healing was possible, that circumstances could change. That hope was not foolish. Her presence inspired people to keep fighting through their own struggles. Jake continued pushing for safety improvements and fair treatment. He trained a promising young worker named Peter to eventually take over as shift supervisor. He wanted to leave the colony in good hands when the time came. He shared everything he knew about managing both the work and the Krell overseers. 6 months after returning from Earth, Claire discovered she was pregnant. She told Jake one evening after dinner. He stared at her in shock and then whooped with joy. He picked her up and spun her around and then set her down carefully, remembering her spine. She laughed and said the doctor had cleared her for normal activities, including pregnancy. She said their baby would be born healthy and whole. The pregnancy changed their timeline. They decided to finish out the year on New Mesa as planned, but then leave before the baby was born. They wanted their child born on Earth or Mars somewhere with proper medical facilities. They wanted to raise their child in freedom. As the months passed and Claire's belly grew, the colony celebrated with them. People donated baby clothes and supplies. Someone carved a wooden crib. The chaplain, Henry, said he looked forward to baptizing the first child born from New Mesa's most famous love story. Jake and Claire's last day on New Mesa was bittersweet. They had made real improvements to the colony. Accident rates were down. Safety protocols were enforced. Workers had more rights and better conditions. Peter was ready to take over as shift supervisor with Claire's replacement handling administration. The work would continue after they left. The colony threw them a farewell party in the common area, the same place where they had been married. People gave speeches about how Jake and Claire had changed their lives, how their story had given hope when hope was scarce, how their love had reminded everyone what humanity meant. Commander Vex even attended the party. He gave a speech that surprised everyone. He said when Jake first volunteered to take Claire's punishment, Vex had thought him a fool. No human should have survived 300 lashes, but Jake had survived through sheer will and love. Vex said he had learned something from watching these two humans. He said love made people stronger than fear ever could. He said Jake and Claire had earned his respect, and he wished them well. Jake stood to give his own speech. He thanked the workers for their support. He said coming to New Mesa had saved his life in ways that had nothing to do with credits or work. He said meeting Claire had given him purpose. He said the people of New Mesa had shown him that community mattered. He said he hoped they would all find their own happiness and freedom someday. Claire spoke last. She thanked everyone for standing by them through everything. She said the false accusation and the 300 lashes and her recovery had been possible to endure because